Hello, bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We have Australia, UK, and Canada, and maybe other time zones who are here. Thank you all for joining us today for this CERC Migration, Migrant Futures webinar. We're going to talk about comparative perspectives on immigration policy changes and their impacts on highly skilled migrants' decision-making in post-pandemic times. We're very pleased to see the interest that this topic has generated and are much looking forward to this conversation. First, please let me do a land acknowledgement, which is now fairly customary in many places, to recognize the territories and the peoples of the lands where we live and work. I'm based at the University of Ottawa, and we actually have an Indigenous affirmation that was developed in partnership with local Indigenous communities and institutions. So Canada, Ottawa being Canada's capital, there are many Indigenous people from many parts across the country. The Indigenous affirmation is meant to promote a spirit of awareness of the relationships between peoples, and in this instance, the relationship between the University of Ottawa community and Indigenous peoples in Canada. So we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor the courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I'm now passing the floor to Ashika Nirawala, who will tell you about the proceedings of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Louisa, and welcome everyone to the CERC Migrant Future webinar. My name is Ashika Nirawala. I am a research fellow here at Canada Excellence Researcher in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson University. As we all know, migration is a complex phenomenon shaped by various socio-economic, political, and demographic factors. And since highly skilled migration is often considered as self-initiated and desired, relatively very little research has focused on the decision-making process of highly skilled migrants. And as we move forward in the post-pandemic times, high-skilled migrant labor is likely to be at the forefront of the economic recovery of many immigrant receiving countries. So in today's webinar, we will explore if and how the COVID-19 pandemic-related risk uncertainties, including the immigration policy changes, may have affected the decision-making processes among the highly skilled migrants. And now it's with a very great pleasure, I would like to introduce to our distinguished panel of speakers for today's webinar, who will be sharing their thoughts on changes in high-skilled immigration-related policies during the pandemic in Canada, Australia, and the UK, and the ways that these policy changes may have influenced migration-related decision-making among highly skilled migrants and their families. Our first speaker is Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Margaret's research interests include gender and migration, transnational networks, and immigrant settlement, in particularly internationally trained healthcare professionals and international students in Canada. Our second speaker is Associate Professor Chris Wright from the University of Sydney in Australia. Chris' research focuses on the intersection of employment, globalization, and public policy, with a particular interest in labor migration and comparative employment relations. And our third speaker is Mujahid Admir, who just defended his PhD in Sociological Studies department at University of Sheffield, the UK. And his research focuses on the intersection of transnational family relationships and academic migration to UK. So before I hand down the Zoom floor to our speakers, both me and Louisa would like to encourage our fantastic Zoom audience, which has now reached almost more than 70, to ask the questions in the chat as the speakers share their thoughts. We will collect the questions and ask them to the speakers later during the session. Now, I would like to invite all three speakers to share their views on in what ways were highly skilled migration-related policy changed for Margaret in Canada, for Chris in Australia, and for Mujahid in the UK in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how did these policy changes impact high-skilled migrants' migration-related decision-making. And each speaker will have around 3 minutes to share their views. And we'll start with Margaret, and then Chris, and then Mujahid.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I hope you can hear me and see me and everything's good. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always so insightful to be part of a CERC event, although I do feel like it kind of keeps us on our toes. It's almost like a sort of Iron Man competition to see if we can all keep up. So let's try and do this in a few minutes, okay? Yeah, I'd like to talk about a few things. I'd like to talk about the disruption to the IRCC work systems that the pandemic introduced. I'd like to talk about some of the policy responses that emerged, particularly the focus on the temporary resident to permanent resident special initiatives. Then thinking about how IRCC responded with increased targets, but to think about the backlogs that we have now witnessed in terms of all of this disruption, and then a final comment on impact on decision-making by immigrants, if we can get there. So the disruption to IRCC work systems, everybody was disrupted by the pandemic, but we need to understand the machine itself that processes all of these applications was heavily disrupted. IRCC workers had to go remote like everybody else, and they're dealing with very sensitive documents. So somebody had to scan all of those documents. Sometimes the scanning didn't take on both sides of the document. And so you can just imagine the disruption that's created into the files that people have to assess, setting up all of those secure remote workstations and so on and so forth. Of course, there was also the suspension of the visa application processes, the biometrics, and health examinations. And of course, again, this all adds to a backlog. There were a lot of instances of people who were ready to come, who were then delayed and causing enormous disruption, family separation, all kinds of travel logistics and border frictions that were imposed. We had the delay of citizenship ceremonies for permanent residents. We've seen some interesting novel approaches to managing them now, hopefully ones that will stay. And of course, significant delays in processing times for submitted applications. So that's one of the first big things. Now, IRCC responded in some ways to the crisis, which was the inability to get people across the border during the pandemic, by actually looking at who was in the country. So the second response was the special kind of initiative that was developed by IRCC, which was to create special options for temporary residents to become permanent residents, so the TRPR pathway. This was announced in April 2021. It was a pathway for over 90,000 essential workers and international graduates who were already actively contributing to the economy, to allow them to get permanent status. And so this was an innovative response. The policy focus was on 3 streams: 20,000 applicants for temporary workers in healthcare, 30,000 for temporary workers in other selected essential occupations, and 40,000 for international students. Now, the 40,000 applications for international students in country filled up in 26 hours. So there was an awful lot of work required in order to get all those applications in. So this is the pent-up demand that was there for that particular pathway. But interestingly, some of the other pathways didn't fill up as quickly, and that was suggesting perhaps some onerous requirements for doing that. But that was an interesting policy initiative taken. So let's think about the third point I wanted to make now, which is that, IRCC did respond to the slowdown of the migration process by actually upping the figures for migration numbers after that. And so all of those increased targets were really impressive in some ways, and many of them have been kind of reached. Recent data that has just been released on the 2021 targets lets us know that the number of foreign nationals who became permanent residents increased 120%. from 2020 to 2021. The number of economic immigrants, of these, like over half were economic migrants, so skilled workers. So we've seen quite some success there, as well as an increase in the number of temporary foreign workers admitted under the International Mobility Programme. And also increasingly foreign students are granted the right to study in Canada. And of course, those of us in the higher education system know what that looked like during the pandemic, which was an innovative kind of partially remote, partially in-country. So all kinds of innovations there. Now, the fourth point, backlogs. All of this sounds great, but we do have an issue of backlogs because, as we mentioned, there was enormous disruption to the system, and then the system picked up speed, wanting to get back to those significant numbers that the levels plans kind of issued. So while we have now about half of all files are in some kind of backlog, according to IRC statistics. So that's about 900,000 files across all of the different groups they're dealing with a backlog. So this is going to need some attention. And then just the final point, the impact on immigrant decision making. For this, I'm turning to an interesting report that came out from World Education Services, or WES. They surveyed their potential clients who were looking to have their credentials assessed for entry to Canada. And they indicated that 90% of potential immigrants surveyed said the pandemic had made no impact on them or made them more interested in migrating to Canada. And interestingly, 58% said they were more interested in migrating to Canada based on the Canadian government's response to the pandemic. Only 21% indicated that they would delay their immigration plans because of pandemic-related things. So what that tells us is immigration decision making. You know, obviously the pandemic affects it, but people are still very keen on moving forward with their plans. And so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Margaret. Chris, would you like to give your review?
Sure. And look, let me also begin by thanking Ashika and Louisa for the invitation, and for Sinthu for all the communications in helping to organise the event today. I guess the brief story I'll tell is there's some parallels and similarities, but also some pretty stark differences, I think, between the Australian and the Canadian case. So in Australia, looking at the ways that high-skilled immigration policies changed in response to the pandemic. Well, essentially, international borders were closed effectively for several years, and temporary migrants, including high-skilled migrants, were told in explicit terms by the government to go home. They were the words, the direct words from the Prime Minister at the time, the Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and the Immigration Minister, who said temporary visa holders, many of whom are high skilled, who are unable to support themselves, are strongly encouraged to return home. And the government explicitly excluded temporary migrants, including high skilled, from all forms of government support, including the wage subsidy program and the extended unemployment support and other measures that were introduced in response to the pandemic. That overlooked the reality that for many temporary migrants, they were not in a position to leave, and the consequences were felt very profoundly by many people. So in the absence of government support, there was essentially a situation where thousands of people in Australia were unable to pay for basic survival means like food and rent, and led many to rely upon support provided by community organisations. So a survey that was conducted in the immediate aftermath of the first wave of the pandemic by Laurie Berg and Bettina Farbenblum revealed that 70% of temporary visa holders lost all or most of their work during the pandemic. And they had no means to supplement that. So this exclusionary approach of basically cutting temporary migrants, including the high skilled, from Social Security was an extension of previous government policies, but it was really magnified during this period. Another key aspect was that Social Security support for permanent skilled migrants, who historically have received the same support as citizens, had been restricted the previous year in 2019. And that again was really higher magnified and amplified during the pandemic, when many permanent highly skilled migrants who needed support because they'd lost their jobs were not able to get it. There was some visas were introduced after these decisions. There was a visa called the Temporary Activity 408 COVID Pandemic Event Visa that allowed temporary migrants to stay in Australia for 12 months if they worked in a key sector. But the general policy approach was, again, exclusion. And also lack of administrative support for those who were able to still come or who were having their visas processed. So the parallel with Canada was the backlog question, huge backlogs, which predated the pandemic. In terms of how this all affected highly skilled migrants' decision-making, well, just to give you an idea of the numbers, the permanent skilled visa intake declined 17% from in the period of the initial period of the pandemic. The temporary skilled migration intake declined around 21%. And the intake of people applying for post-study work visas, so those who had completed their degrees in Australia and then had an opportunity to undertake work related to their degrees, declined 16%. Now, the applications and the visas being issued have partly recovered as the borders have reopened over the past 12 months or so. But Australia is, in contrast to what Margaret was saying about Canada, Australia is struggling to attract high skilled migrants compared to the pre-pandemic levels. And that seems to be pretty clearly related to the discursive exclusion that was promoted very forcefully by the government at the time, and also due to other restrictions on high skilled migrants' rights, their mobility and their access to support. And I will just finish by just saying that Dimitria Groutzis, Annika Kabel and I have an article just published last week in Work Employment Society, which really highlights the nature of some of these policies and the discursive exclusion of highly skilled migrants during the pandemic. And I've just shared the link to that article in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Now I would like to pass the floor to Mujahid.
Thank you, Ashika. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, and I thank very much for the CERC Migration Group for having me here today. So for the context of the UK, I'll talk about how the immigration policy has changed within the context of the UK. I think this is a really huge topic, but I will be very precise and I will try to answer this question in time with my PhD thesis, which was on the migrant academics in the UK. So the COVID-19 crisis coincided with the two historical policy changes, the policy shifts in the UK migration regime. The first policy shift was the peak of anti-migration discourses. We know the 2016, the Brexit and the following xenophobia, anti-immigration discourses. And then we had the Syrian civil war crisis and 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these all kind of combined and created a kind of anti-immigration discourse. But at the same time, this second kind of policy shift was the government's aim to attracting more kind of skilled migrants. So it was a kind of a long process. It started in 2002, the UK government, they argued that they had a vision to make the UK a global super science power. So during the COVID-19 crisis, the UK government launched the new point-based system. It's a really huge system, but to be precise, there are three consequences of this system. The first one is that after the Brexit, the EU and non-EU skilled migrants, and they both need to get visas in order to work in the UK. Secondly, all migrants who are subjected to immigration control are considered under the scheme of NRPF. NRPF stands for the no recourse to public funds. So basically, this means that all migrants who are subjected to immigration control, they will be excluded from the public benefits. So this was a really negative impact, especially during the peak of the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, this new system created some thresholds for skilled migrants. So in this new system, they had a different salary thresholds for different occupations. So during the pandemic, we saw that all of these kind of historical changes, they kind of penetrated into the skilled migrants' lives and their decision-making processes. So during the pandemic, I can say that the migrants that I worked with, the migrant academics, and their decision-making processes, they were kind of filled with uncertainty, first of all, because this uncertainty coming from their visa and residency issues. For example, in 2020, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, she said that she promised migrants that nobody will be punished for the circumstances outside of their control. But after that, the UK government, they said that if the skilled migrants, they return to their country of origins and they had too much absences from the UK, they will be exempted from getting an indefinite leave to remain, which is a permanent residence. Also, the skilled migrants, they had a really sharp decrease in the household incomes. So we had seen the job losses, the problems with the employment contracts. For example, in the context of migrant academics, many UK universities, they argued that they will shrink their staff numbers. Migrant academics were at the forefront of these kind of shrinking policies. So there were also a mistrust towards the government and towards the bodies. So, for example, it was really interesting that in 2020, the government increased the health insurance surcharge, the NHS health surcharge of the skilled migrants. And this included the nurses, doctors, and the healthcare workers. So there was a kind of a public and media indignation because at that time, the global COVID pandemic was kind of a peak. So after this kind of a media and political indignation, the government, they said that, okay, we kind of exempted the healthcare workers from this kind of increase regarding the NHS health surcharge. So therefore, as I said, it is kind of an interesting story that on the one hand, the UK government is kind of trying to encourage the skilled migration, and even in the context of the global pandemic, the UK government can kind of increase the insurance surcharge of the skilled migrants. So I can say that these kind of changes can kind of influence as a kind of mistrust, uncertainty, and job losses, and then a really sharp decrease in the household incomes. I think I need to leave it there.
Thank you so much to all the speakers for this presenting a very informative portrayals of immigration policy changes across Canada, Australia, and UK, which are like traditionally immigrant receiving countries, and how these countries' introductions of diverse immigration policies, some harsh immigration measures, but also like some immigrant-friendly policy measures had impacted immigrants' trajectories and the families' decision-making to move to a new country, and how it was filled with uncertainty and mistrust, as we have been discussing. Now, I would like to invite all three speakers for a very, very brief remark for about 1 minute on each other's views, if you have any. We'll start with Margaret.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see some of the differences that may in part be in how we've responded to the questions you've asked us based on our own research. But I will say it's interesting in terms of the UK. I attended a presentation where a colleague, Dan Hibbert, who had provided data on the Canadian situation to indicate, like, look, everything's good, everything's back to where it was pre-pandemic in terms of the levels and the numbers of immigrants coming, and this is a good news story because we're happy about this because we want immigrants. And then in the audience was a colleague from the UK who said, interestingly enough, I could tell the same story based on the data we have, but we don't want to tell that story because the government doesn't feel comfortable telling people that story. And so that gives you immediately that difference in terms of the political discourse and rhetoric of those two countries, and how the policies are effectively the same, but how governments kind of take that data and share it with their with the country was quite different.
Chris? Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks very much for the presentations. I mean, I think it's really useful and interesting because in Australia, both the UK and especially Canada have been common reference points for why Australia is struggling to attract high-skilled migrants, especially post-pandemic. Those exclusionary policies Australia had contrasted very much with the approach, or the discourse, at least by the Canadian government, it seems. And there's a common refrain, you know, in the media, in commentary, about, you know, we need to do more. We need to be more like the Canadians if we want to succeed in attracting high-skilled people to Australia. So, and that kind of was highlighted to some extent, I think, pretty strongly in Margaret's presentation, and also to some extent in Mujahid's as well. And I'll get to some of the policies that people are calling for in my comments to the next question, but there's some interesting parallels there as well, I think, with the other countries.
Thank you, Chris. Mujahid, would you share your thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you. I thank very much for Margaret and Chris, their presentation as well. So I agree with Chris, and because these countries, Australia, Canada, and the UK, they are kind of a reference points for the kind of the migration policies of the rest of the world. So it's really interesting to see, especially how policies, you know, how policies kind of influence on the governments and people and their kind of motivation to attract more skilled migrants. So it's really interesting to make these comparisons. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so to kind of shift gears more towards the future, we wanted to ask you, based on you know, the key summaries that you've done, what are the main takeaways of these pandemic-related immigration policy changes that researchers, including the audience here, and policymakers, and there may be actually policymakers with us, that we need to pay attention to? So maybe, you know, the key shifts that you think are significant, but also pay attention to as we move in increasingly what we call a post-pandemic world, and whatever that might be. So what are a little bit, you know, in terms of your projections, what you think are the key points that we need to pay attention to? So we will shift the order and hear first from Mujahid on the UK situation and sort of your predictions.
Yeah, I would like to divide my kind of response into two. So first of all, the pandemic, the COVID-19 global pandemic, it showed us that the significance of these skilled migrants, because during the COVID-19 process, for the context of the UK, and there were really significant numbers of migrant workers who are considered as the essential workers or the key workers who were fighting at the forefront against the COVID-19 pandemic. So to give you a kind of a brief kind of statistical numbers, that nearly 33% of doctors who had a certificate with NHS were from non-UK nationals, and this number can go to 20, 35 or 40 in some cases, for example, in the nurseries and healthcare workers. So this kind of shows the significance of the skilled migration. And it was really interesting that because it also kind of showed us the questioning the definition of skill as well. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, in the context of the UK, there was a kind of a short crisis of the supply chain, the food supply chain, and the farm owners in the UK, they started chartered flights to bring workers from Poland and Romania to pick fruits and vegetables. So interestingly, Brexit aimed to ban the same Polish and Romanian workers. So it turns out that nearly 99% of fruit pickers, vegetable pickers in the UK were foreigners and were seasonal migrants. Therefore, the COVID-19 context, it kind of showed us the kind of the diverse structure of the society and the significance of migrants in terms of some key and essential areas of the society. And secondly, in terms of the academic literature, there needs to be more kind of emphasis on the personal and familial dimensions of the skilled migration. And this was an argument I emphasized in my PhD thesis a lot, because in the context of migrant academics, many migrant academics, I found in my PhD thesis that they turned to their immediate ties, their family ties and friendship circles when the COVID-19 happened. It can be through their local interaction or transnational contact. So the care of their family members was of paramount significance, and many migrant academics, they called them regularly, and there was a kind of check-in culture. So, however, on the literature on skilled migration, it has a kind of more wider and structural focus on the developmental levels of countries. And, you know, one of the most used concepts is the brain drain. The literature kind of is obsessed with brain gain and brain waste, brain circulation, and so on. And I really like to quote an article written by two Italian researchers. The title of the article is called "The Brains and Bodies on the Move." It kind of stresses that these people do not have only their brains. They also have their bodies, their families, and their personal kind of interactions, social interactions. So in terms of the academic literature, we need to understand the human face of these skilled migration flows, because these human face of these skilled migration flows, it can also impact on their decision-making processes and their mobility trajectories as well. So, so I think this is also a point worth considering in terms of the skilled migration literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these important insights. So we'll shift to Chris and the situation in Australia.
Thanks, Louisa. So look, I think in terms of this question about what are the key takeaways of the pandemic policy changes and what are the things that we need to pay attention to post-pandemic, the key takeaway in Australia is that exclusionary measures deter high-skilled migrants that are really important for the economy and society. So as I mentioned, Australia's really facing difficulty getting the skilled migrants that it needs. And this is contributing to skill shortages and other constraints upon the economy and society as well. And so the good thing is that the government, we have a new government now, and they're taking this problem very seriously. And they're currently conducting a major review of the migration system and of all elements of it. And so my colleague Stephen Clibborn and I have had the opportunity to give evidence to the review, and we've written a submission and given oral evidence. And the key three things that we've called upon the government to do in its overhaul of the migration system, particularly regarding highly skilled migrants, is threefold. The first is that there needs to be a greater focus upon permanent residency and strengthening pathways between temporary and permanent migration. We've seen a big shift in Australia away from permanent residency towards temporary residency. and making it harder for temporary migrants, including high skilled, to get permanent residency. And that has clearly deterred many people from coming here who might have otherwise come. And it has excluded many people who have come here because they haven't been able to basically have the certainty to build a new life, or potentially do so. The second thing is that we've called for the abolition of visas that tie skilled migrants to a single employer. So the current temporary skilled visa system is based around employer sponsorship. That has directly contributed to problems of mistreatment and exploitation, because basically an employer can hold a skilled migrant's residency status over them, and if they don't comply with the employer's directives, including unreasonable ones, they face the risk of losing their right to live in Australia. So we've called for the replacement of sponsorship visas with mobility visas, allowing skilled migrants or temporary skilled migrants to be able to move freely with employers without restrictions. And the third thing is that we've called for a restoration of institutional protections for temporary skilled migrants at work. There's major problems around people having their rights, their workplace rights, enforced. And also for measures designed to provide greater post-arrival support. So there's very little post-arrival support for temporary skilled migrants in Australia, and this is something that contributes to problems of marginalisation. So those three measures would help to address many of the problems that the pandemic highlighted around temporary migrants being marginalised and mistreated, and those measures we think would go a long way to fixing these problems.
Thank you. And I know some of these issues are also relevant for Canada, so I'm eager to hear what Margaret has to say.
Great, thanks. And thank you to my fellow panelists for highlighting these other issues. And I focused very specifically on policy issues and identified three things that I think are important. The first one is the idea of digitizing workflow and modernizing systems of credential recognition. I mean, I think the pandemic did give us an opportunity to innovate, and some of those systems need to stay in place now. I'd also highlight the importance of increasing pre-departure processing as much as possible, and also enhancing service eligibility for temporary residents. That's something that became apparent during the pandemic, and with the increased number of temporary residents, we need more service eligibility. And then the third one is thinking about transit migration, and also issues about relational factors in sending or transit countries. And so just briefly, I mean, I've mentioned the digitizing workflow. I think that we need to see a modernization of application systems. In the Canadian context, it's been an endemic long-term issue that credential recognition processes take a long time. They are very involved. And there's a lot of innovation that happened during COVID. I mean, I look at nurses especially, and there's things that have changed that hopefully will stay in place now, that will speed up and ease the ability of skilled migrants to have their credentials recognized. Also for IRCC, as well as professional regulators, these systems need to be modernized. Pre-departure training is important. I think immigrants need to know much more ahead of time before they make those decisions and arrive in country. And when they do arrive in country, we need to be making sure that they're eligible for services, even if they're temporary residents, because increasingly the temporary residents to permanent residents is just like a distension, if you like, of the immigration process. And we need to be getting everybody sort of hitting the ground and having all of the systems of support they can, regardless of whether they're temporary or permanent. And then on transit migration, I mean, this is just the thing that I'm interested in terms of thinking about what migration scholars might be looking at. Again, in the World Education Survey, what was interesting is when they looked at the countries from which their survey respondents were coming from, they looked at what's your country of citizenship and what's your country of residence at the current time. And what was interesting is the difference between those. So while the country of residence for their top survey respondents were India, Nigeria, the Philippines, Lebanon, and Pakistan, when they asked about what's your country of residence, it was India, Canada, Nigeria, the UAE, the Philippines, and then also Saudi Arabia and the USA. And so what you have there is an indication of the increasingly complex migration pathways that skilled migrants especially are using. They're engaging in two-step and different forms of multiple migrations. And transit migration means that individuals are in other countries, and for skilled migrants also, they're in those countries often building up their careers, gaining much more broader experiences. You know, if you think of the health professionals that we've been discussing, you think of doctors having residencies in the US, for example, and then looking forward. And so there's a lot more we need to be thinking about. It's not just a source country, destination country thing. We've got a much more varied landscape within which people are making decisions, thinking about how they can go from one country to another, and what's the relationship between those countries in terms of the visas that people can access, and so on and so forth. And as I said, this is important for skilled workers because this is them in their career building phase. And then just the final point there was to think about, I mean, I was reading the Hein de Haas piece on the capabilities and aspirations model. And one of the things that struck me was their argument that really what's more important is the relative deprivation that people face in the source country or in the transit country. So people are making decisions based on the place that they're in. They're not necessarily thinking about what's it going to be like when I get to that destination country. What they think is it's just going to be better in general. But the driving issue is, what are things like for me here right now? But I think that's interesting because Chris's comments about how the perception of Australian, the welcome mat got a bit frayed in the pandemic. And so I think understanding how decision making occurs within that kind of matrix of complexity between the source, the destination, and the transit country is something that I think we should be focusing on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Yeah, what you said about the increasingly complex migration/career trajectories that overlap is important. And I'm sure, Mujahid, maybe in the context of migrant academics, this is something in a tight market that is increasingly significant. So I'll invite now our three speakers to briefly react and remark on each other before we open the floor to broader discussion. So we'll go in the same order. Mujahid, if you'd like to react or remark.
Thank you, Louise. I think Margaret and Chris and they kind of put forward really interesting kind of policy suggestions, and I agree with Chris in terms of his focus on the focus on the permanent residency. And for example, I can also give an example to this in the context of the UK. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, many migrant academics that I talked with, and they were really concerned about their permanent residency. As I said, if you would like to get an indefinite leave to remain in the context of the UK, and the UK government require the migrant academic to be in the UK, and too much absences can negatively impact the permanent residency. So this was a really significant issue among the migrant academics in the UK as well, and also some of the unions of the academics. They're kind of trying to raise awareness to the permanent residency issues of the skilled migrants. And also, I found the suggestion of Margaret's on the digitizing the workflow really interesting and really important. Again, in the context of the UK, and we have seen the closures of the consulates and the Home Secretary offices. And in 2021, the Home Secretary, they launched a kind of a telephone application to run the visa processes for the migrants, and it was really kind of successful. So, and I think yes, one of the things that the COVID-19 kind of showed us, the migration regime that, you know, these kind of workflow, especially getting visa or permanent residency, can be digitized or should be digitized. I think it could be, you know, really practical for second migrants. I think these are really, really important and significant suggestions. I thank both of the speakers.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, to you now.
Yeah, thanks to Mujahid and to Margaret too. Yeah, some really insightful points raised by both of them. I think that Margaret's comments about the greater efficiency and around skills and credential recognition and how digitalisation can enhance that, that's something that Australia really needs to learn as well. I think it's a long-standing problem of barriers to skills recognition. And the technology is enabling those challenges to be overcome more effectively, and it's just not happening yet. It hasn't been embraced in Australia, and those remarks are really interesting. Also, the visa processing delays. I mentioned that before briefly. In Australia, there was a backlog of 1 million around this time last year, and it's been reduced to 900,000. So, you know, it's a major problem, and the government is now saying it's addressing it seriously, but major problems. And I think this really speaks to what Mujahid was saying about what this means for the people involved. It creates considerable uncertainty and precarity for the people who are, you know, waiting for their visas to be processed and not knowing what their future holds if they are, you know, are waiting for their applications to be processed. And so yeah, I thought Mujahid's remarks around this were very insightful. So thanks.
Thank you. And Margaret, the last word.
Yeah, and thank you to Chris and Mujahid for their comments and observations, because it's fascinating to get a sense of how this is working out. The same kinds of structural processes, but different policy responses that have significant kind of consequences in the medium and the long term, perhaps short term as well. But I think the issue of the temporary resident experience is really significant in all cases. And so Canada has seen a significant increase in the number of temporary residents. And one of the things that is important to note about it is that, unlike the permanent resident process where the federal government through IRCC has some kind of control over it, you know, in terms of the temporary residents, they're demand driven in terms of the higher education institutions. They want students, international students. In fact, they need international students because the funding system has really, you know, diminished the amount of public funding they can access. So they're looking to international students. So they want international students, and then IRCC just sort of processes the applications. And the same for temporary workers. Often it's the private sector, it's employers that are driving that demand. And similarly here in Canada for essential workers in care assistant roles, living, you know, agricultural. And so this is a disconnect because the numbers that come in are not necessarily under the control of IRCC. I mean, they're processing it, but in some ways they're doing it as a response to the sectors. And we have to pay close attention to what's happening with that, because we have an untapped supply, and then there's a really tapped amount of a limited number of people who might actually make that transition to permanent residence. So that's where people's homes and hopes and dreams and aspirations get really kind of crushed in that waiting process.
Thank you to all the speakers for very insightful thoughts. We have a few questions in the chat box. I will try to bundle them together and ask to you. I'll start up with a few questions for all the speakers for your very short remarks. So one of the questions is, if we regard the pandemic as a crisis, is the crisis over then? In particular, from the point of view of the policymakers and of migrants. There was also kind of related questions that asked, many of the economies have recovered from the pandemic. Have migration levels not recovered to pre-pandemic levels in these economies, like in Canada, in the UK and Australia? Is it jobless or migration-less economic recovery? And the last one that I will ask in this round is, would you characterize the way in which Australia, Canada, and the UK dealt with migration management during the pandemic crisis as resilient? I think we'll start with Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Big questions. Okay.
Yes.
I might start with the last one first. No, I would not characterize the response of Australia during the pandemic as resilient. I would say it was the opposite of that. I mean, there's two things to separate. The first is the border closures, and the second is the discursive or the policies towards migrants who are in Australia. The border closures, I'd say there was kind of pretty much quite widespread support, particularly during the pandemic. The initial stages of the pandemic, acceptance that when, that just thinking back to, February, March 2020, I guess the fear that was around the world around this, was pretty palpable. And there was acceptance that border closures were a necessary part of the response to this. As the pandemic went on, there was a view that this was too restrictive and going on too long. But nevertheless, the border closures were generally accepted to a large degree. The response, the exclusionary policies towards temporary migrants was totally avoidable. And 3 years on, we're still living with the consequences of that. And it's hard to separate, I guess, the response. Like basically, there's a major crisis in Australia's migration system. It predates a pandemic, but the pandemic, the unresilience or the lack of resilience in the government's response to it at the time exacerbated those problems significantly. And so in that sense, we're still living with the pandemic or the policies implemented during it.
Thank you, Chris. Margaret, would you want to add a few points?
Yeah, I'll so is the crisis over? No, I mean, I think we're in a perpetual crisis now. There's all different terms, that have been produced for this. We seem to lumber from one crisis to the next. We had COVID, we have the crisis of inflation, we have the cost of living crisis, we have the housing affordability crisis. This is all going to probably be eclipsed by the climate crisis. So we should be getting used to this and figuring out how we're going to manage. So I would say that's what's upon us. Sorry. In terms of the resilience question, I mean, okay, so this is a seminar, this is a panel about skilled migration policy, right? So if I look at the Canadian case in terms of was it resilient? Well, resilient. Did the system bounce back? Well, if we just look at the numbers, yes, it did, right? Canada's immigration system got back on track, right? So that would say, yes, it was resilient. But I think if you want to ask, is it resilient in terms of people managing and surviving? I mean, I think immigrants as well as everybody else, as I said, all of these perpetual crises that we're now facing suggest that we're not necessarily resilient as a society. The policy making may be resilient and could adapt, but what's happening underneath this? And the other thing is, we know that in terms of the different set groups of categories of immigrants that come to Canada, we had refugees and asylum seekers have not been fully made whole. I mean, by what happened by the pandemic. I mean, there was the people were kind of shut out and we didn't re-engage, and we have a lot of trouble housing even the number of refugees that we accept now. So that crisis is really intensified for that particular group. So and for the low skilled temporary residents as well. So I think you're asking about skilled migration here, but if we think about other categories, then no, we're not seeing resilient systems. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Mujahid, would you want to add something?
Thank you, Ashika. Regarding the first question, is the crisis over? For the context of the UK, I think the crises are going on because, as I said at the outset of my response, there are really kind of historical issues and structural issues the context of the UK is kind of struggling with. The Brexit and anti-immigration discourses, as I said, Syrian refugee crisis and 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on the other hand, the government, again, in 2021, 2 years ago, the government tries to attract more skilled migrants, and they would like to make the UK a global kind of superpower. But as I said, these kind of motivations are still kind of negatively influenced by by Brexit and anti-immigration discourses. During the COVID-19 global pandemic, the UK government, they kind of launched its new point-based system in 2020, and they argued that this new point-based system will offer the UK migration regime flexibility and kind of systemic resilience, and because they thought that it will increase the overall human capital, and they will create a kind of human capital pool. And they kind of launched this shortage occupation system. So in this new system, the UK government determines some of the occupations, and they say that these occupations and these professions are in the shortage occupation system, and there are different thresholds for these different skilled migrants. But evaluations in the literature, they argued that this kind of system didn't work because there are not enough kind of strong methodologies to measure satisfactorily the which occupations are in shortage or which occupations the UK needs. So conversely, I mean, for the context of the UK during the COVID-19, I think the new point-based system and the shortage occupation list, they didn't work because, as I said, I gave the examples of the fruit pickers. I mean, the UK migration regime didn't thought the fruit pickers and vegetable pickers were kind of in the shortage occupation list. So there is not enough methodology to measure which professions are in shortage. And regarding the question about the social support, as I said, in the context of the UK, we have the NRPF, the no recourse to public funds, and this applies to non-EEA residents. I mean the non-European background residents, because there were stratifications between skilled migrants. For example, migrant academics who are from non-European countries, they get less social support and public funds. So there are also significant stratifications among skilled migrants. Finally, I can also say that, for example, the people of color, the migrant workers, the BME, the Black and minority migrant workers who were fighting against the COVID-19, studies found that they were the migrant group that were affected from the COVID-19 in a really the most bad way. So I think there are also stratifications in terms of the social support and public funds within the context of the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. We have lots of questions in the chat box, but due to the time limitation, I'll just briefly ask a couple of the questions from the chat box. And one of the very important and I think relevant question in the chat box was, it seems that in all three contexts, there might be a hardening in terms of what are considered skills and who is considered as a skilled migrant, which has actually very important gender implication. So how might the gender composition of skilled migrant streams change in response to the post-pandemic policy changes? And another one regarding, so considering the post-pandemic immigration policy weaknesses in access to health services and social protection systems, how can structural determinants of skilled migrants' health and welfare be recognized and addressed through more progressive, committed, and genuine actions? And maybe this time we could start off with Margaret. They're very big questions, but
they are very big questions, and I'll try and answer. So the one from Belinda, yes, I mean, Anna Bush's work is really interesting in terms of the argument that feminized skills and professions because they are in a sector that typically might get undervalued, like care. I mean, it's the classic issue of what is a skill, and yet the socially constructed nature of skills. And so I think this is something that we are all struggling with in terms of the care crisis. And I mean, there was that portal that was open for a bit with the Build Back Better agenda, which there was an awful lot of optimism attached to that. It seems that the inflation and the potential of recession is going to likely kind of close that down. But I do think it's interesting. And I think that there was another question in here about the NOC C and D pathways for immigrants. And so the National Occupational Classification, which is the lower skilled or lower paid skills at C and D. I mean, there are some pathways in terms of the provincial nominee program, because those places have said, you know what, we need, you know, truck drivers, we need care assistants, we need these essential workers, and we're willing to use our PNP allocation in order to attract them. So I think we're going to have a big discussion about, you know, what do we think of as skilled? You know, if there's a shortage and you need those workers and they're in demand, then that's a skill you want, right? And we've had the same discussion, like it takes some skill to be able to work with a patient who's suffering with Alzheimer's, and you have to deal with 15 people on the same floor, and you have to manage I mean, that's highly skilled, right? But we don't see it as such because it's low paid. So we have a lot of work to go in terms of also just these demographic changes that we're going through. So that issue about skills is a really important one to keep thinking about. Sorry if I didn't answer that very well. And then, sorry, what was the other one, Ashika, you wanted us to answer, or I can leave it there if you like.
Sorry, my computer had some issues. So maybe we could go to Chris for the next one. And it was, so considering the post-pandemic migration policy weakness in access to healthcare services and also social protection system, how can structural determinants of skilled migrants' health and welfare be recognized and addressed through more progressive, committed, and genuine actions?
Well, I think it can be addressed by having a more far-sighted and inclusive approach towards migrants' access to health and welfare support. And I think this goes to, Marcia's made a comment as well about the need to acknowledge temporary migrants need access to pre and post arrival services. I fully endorse that comment, and it's a consequence, as Marcia alludes to, of neoliberalism, and that is a view that that policies that restrict migrants' access to welfare in Australia, at least, motivated by design by governments to maximise the budgetary impacts and the budgetary benefits of migration, and that was done by, you know, excluding people's access to welfare support through a very short-term lens, that doing so would add more to the government revenue. But what it does is it creates costs, you know, because people need support, which might deter them from coming in the first place, or might encourage them to leave, which then contributes to skills problems, which then, you know, has consequences. So a more longer term and holistic and inclusive approach is socially important, but also economically intelligent, I would say, too, because you're giving people access to the services they need is going to encourage them to, well, is necessary, and that should be the end of it. But governments are still, to some extent, seeing it through this short-term economic neoliberal view, unfortunately. Hopefully that's changing.
We hope so too, Chris. Thank you. Muzahid, would you want to add a few remarks?
Thank you, Ashika. Regarding the question about the definition of skill, I totally agree with the argument in the question, because the skill is kind of defined and described with regards to its utilizability with the capitalist and societal system. But as I said before, during the COVID-19 crisis, it showed us questioning the definition of skill as well. You know, we also need the truck drivers and fruit pickers as well. But in the context of the UK, there are 2 or 3 different scales, the RPF scales. They kind of describe the skills in terms of its annual salary thresholds. But as I said, it also should be questioned. And within the context of the migrant women, and as I said before, there's a really gender dimension with regard to the definition of skill as well. Within the context of migrant academic mothers, for example, in my research, I found that during the COVID-19 crisis, the migrant academic mothers were one of the most kind of negatively affected from the situation, because one of the most striking arguments in the literature is that in the UK, we have a really neoliberal higher education system, and we are discussing the precarious contracts of the academics and the low wages, and the unions are kind of striking all the time. But at the same time, migrant academics, they also need to deal with the issues of visas and residency, and we have a really kind of restrictive migration regime as well. So these migrant academics, they kind of struck between two kind of forces: the neoliberal higher education regime and the restrictive migration regime. But on top of that, the migrant academic mothers, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, they also deal with the care obligations and the care commitments coming from their local families and their transnational families as well. Some of the migrant academic mothers that I interviewed within the scope of my PhD, they said that they were considering quitting from academia because there are kind of overlapping expectations, both coming from their professions and their immediate and transnational families. So I think this was a really significant topic worth considering when we are discussing the gender dimension of the skill migration. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three presenters. And I think the webinar really showed how taking comparative perspectives with these three similar yet so different countries, we could get such a rich array of understandings in terms of the innovations, the questions of resilience, but also it has shown the complexity, the level of integration. And I really like what Margaret said about the multidimensionality of resilience. Even if the immigration system or policy is resilient, what about all the other systems and the peoples? So we also thank the audience for participating and pushing us to think further through the very insightful questions. Thank you to CERC for supporting this, and Ashika for co-organizing. We hope to see you again soon at one of the many events that the CERC is hosting. We wish you all great, I guess, either day or night or end of the day, afternoon. Thank you especially to Chris for getting up early and Mujahid to staying with us at this late hour. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.